it's dangerous to keep saying that anyone who makes any points on this is associated with the hard right. That is precisely the demonisation.
He did say it wasn't the case.
No, but actually, no, not in this instance.
But
I've just mentioned the hard right lots and lots of times.
But you do have to accept that, even it is not the view for everybody, but you have to accept that you keep adding fuel to the fire of what the far right and those that have particularly
the fuel to the fire
dangerous perspectives.
Claire Fox is brilliant in this debate about Islamic blasphemy laws. Labour is just pathetic and weak like the Christian on the panel. The entire panel and the spokesman for the Muslim Council of Britain defend the recent conviction of a man who burned the Quran. They call anyone who objects far right. We all know no one would have been arrested if they burned the Bible. That's because Christianity doesn't have special protection like Islam does, and Christians don't try to kill anyone who offends their religion. I would never burn any religious text, but I don't want to see people who do murdered or charged. We see people burning British flags on the street all the time, and the police never arrest them. The guy who was burning the Quran was savagely attacked with a knife and run over. Nobody mentions that. The Muslim Council spokesman seems like he is subtly saying blasphemy laws are needed to prevent that from happening in the future. An autistic boy's mum was dragged in front of an Islamic court to plead for her son's life because he mishandled a Quran. A teacher and his family were forced into hiding because he showed a picture of Prophet Muhammad in school. The police did nothing. The more people we import from third world Islamic countries, the less free speech we'll have. It's as simple as that. And the more we'll see authoritarian violence aimed towards anyone who dares to criticise Islam. It's an absolute disaster for Britain. We will become more divided and the potential for civil unrest will increase massively. That's the path we are currently going down. It's a damning indictment on the political class in Britain that only one person dared to speak out on the panel. Here's the debate.
The judge was very clear on this. But if you decide to do something that is targeting specific people by going outside a Turkish consulate where you think there are going to be lots of Muslims, where the rationale for what you're doing is targeting Muslims in this way, then there's a problem.
Well, first of all, yes, you can, because you should be able to ridicule, mock, make fun of any religion and that not be used interchangeably with the idea that therefore you have a prejudice against people who practice that faith, and that's of any faith. There is a danger that in this debate that there is a particular sensitivity in relation to Islam, and people are very anxious and nervous politically about criticising anybody. We know that from some of the big political issues around, for example, the rape gangs in northern towns, a huge scandal, and people said they felt they couldn't do anything because they didn't want to be accused of Islamophobia. So we know all that goes on. But I mean, in this instance, this was first of all outside the Turkish consulate, right, which is a political building. The idea that because in the Turkish consulate there will be Muslims, you can't have an act of protest is ludicrous. Secondly, the notion and the judgment is scary in this way, which is don't be provocative with your protest. Well, I mean, what's the point in protesting unless you're going to provoke someone? And then the evidence of this was that the person was both stabbed and somebody ran over them. So in other words, it's victim blaming. You're basically saying if your actions could lead to somebody else being provoked, then they shouldn't happen. And that is a terrible way for us to conduct, I mean, any discussion on speech crime. I mean, I think that there's an assault on free speech anyway, and I think that it is a backdoor route to a blasphemy law, and we should be very anxious about encouraging it.
Mikdad, what do you say to that? It's a backdoor to blasphemy laws.
It's not, because the judgment was very clear. It's nothing to do with that. I think you have to be very, very careful about mixing two things up. What the ruling is actually saying and what right-wing commentators who have a certain agenda at play, who consistently and continuously talk about Muslims in a negative way, those people and the way they're framing. I think we have to distinguish between the two. Look, this is an individual who in his interview was talking about how he thinks that 99% of rapists are Muslim. Like this is the type of attitude that this person had, and the judge reached the conclusion that the defendant was motivated, at least in part, by hostility towards members of a particular religious group. It wasn't about Islam. The view of the judge was that the defendant was motivated, at least in part, by hostility towards Muslims. That's what's driven this. And look, we're talking about public disorder. You can have different views on where you should protest, what you can do, and I agree with that. You need to have freedom of protest. We need to have freedom of expression. We need to make sure that we're not hampering the ability for someone to have a strong and robust criticism and even be provocative about it. But if you are doing something which is likely to lead to public disorder, and you are doing so in a way that is provocative and likely to lead to disorder, and it is motivated in part by hostility towards members of a particular group, and you're doing this in the public, then obviously that's a public disorder offence, which the judge then has to define. And I don't think this has anything to do with the blasphemy law. People who are framing it as such are doing so in a way that is very divisive, problematic, and just helps fuel their own agenda, which unfortunately is something that they need to do because politically they want to try and attract certain groups to vote for them.
I have to clarify one.
Let's just let Claire come back.
I do have to clarify one thing. See, already we've got into a situation where my comments have now been seen as right-wing or far-right or some kind of provocative, divisive effect. I am making a point about free speech, and immediately you have to do that, I'm told by our guest, because you're trying to disguise your deep-seated hostility to Muslims. And of course, that is exactly what my fear is. Then the person who has committed this act we're being told that his views are the wrong kind of views. He's got unacceptable views.
Well, the judge actually said the burning of the religious book and the making of criticism of Islam were not necessarily disorderly. It was about the timing and location of the conduct and the abusive language.
I understand, but what I'm saying is we shouldn't have a situation in which somebody's views are considered in this way to be a criminal offence. That's what I'm suggesting is the danger. And I think that you can say, oh, well, burn your Quran secretly somewhere else where nobody can see it. Don't let anyone see it. I mean, if it's a protest, as an aside, this is not something that one would advocate. No one is going around here inciting people to burn Qurans. But I think you should be free to burn a Quran outside the Turkish consulate or anywhere else.
Richard, where are you on this?
Well, I think religion shouldn't be exempt from a kind of level of criticism that any other organisation would be. I think it's good for religions to make the case for themselves and also to answer their critics. But I agree with Mikdad. I think that freedom of expression is mitigated by certain factors, and one of them would be public order. So I think this is about a public order issue, not necessarily a blasphemy issue. But I'm all for people to say whatever they like, to ridicule religion, I know you get plenty of that. And of course, as Church of England, as Church of England, I'm just used to seeing people like me in situation comedy.
This is about whether you're inciting religious hatred, if you're motivating people to take action against a particular group or a particular religion. We are absolutely right to have existing offences which are upheld, as has happened in this situation. Unfortunately, what we have is the leader of the Conservative Party, who has nothing better to spend her time tweeting about, who sees an opportunity, who is trying to play some strange game, I think, with Nigel Farage and reform.
Which, by the way, the National Secular Society have come out with, many civil liberties organisations, free speech organisations. It's not a left-right thing. And I think to try and infer that anybody who is concerned about what is a serious case, that's why it's all over the newspapers, why it's being discussed by the BBC and so on, is a matter of some concern in a country that's a free country when people are effectively being found to be criminal for doing something which could at least be seen as blasphemous. We also, and then we have this discussion, and suddenly anyone who says that is in bad faith trying to stir up hatred against Muslims. And what I'm saying is that's precisely the chilling impact that we've seen far too much in relation to any discussion or criticism of anything even tangentially related to Islam. And I think that's very nerve-wracking. That has got nothing to do with appeasing reform, being a Tory, or any such thing. It's to do with people who care about civil liberties and free speech. And many people in the legal profession as well have said that this was a prosecution that shouldn't have occurred, and that actually there's some rows going on in the legal profession. It's not a clear-cut case that this would be found guilty. Most of the lawyers I talked to yesterday said wouldn't be found guilty. Mikdad,
just come back on that. I mean, are you having a chilling effect on freedom of speech?
My opinion is somehow chilling someone who's in the House of Lords and publicly talking about this issue on a regular basis. I think we have to be realistic about what's happening here. There are people who are trying to stir up and incite people and divide people. This is not one of those cases. I think it's completely fair to have a discussion on burning of the Quran and the fact that it should not be something that is a core driver for a decision on free speech. I agree with having those discussions, but this is not a blasphemy law. And this idea that, there is this underlying view that is being perpetrated and propagated by those in the hard right. And I'm not saying that this is the case for everybody who's on this topic today, but that they're pushing this view that Muslims are taking over, South Asians are taking over. We saw what Nigel Farage was talking about, Anas Sarwar, earlier this week. There's just misrepresentation of what's happening to try and blow into this specific narrative about Muslims and those who are different. And I think that's a dangerous narrative, and that's just not the case in this situation.
Okay.
It's dangerous to keep saying that anyone who makes any points on this is associated with the hard right. That is precisely the demonisation.
He did say it wasn't the case.
No, but actually, no, not in this instance.
You have to
but I'll just mention the hard
that.
right lots and lots of times.
But you do have to accept that, even it is not the view for everybody, but you have to accept that you keep adding fuel to the fire of what the far right and those that have particularly
the fuel to the fire
dangerous perspectives that are driving divisions within our community and within our society. Okay. In my constituency, I've got 15% of my constituents who are Muslim, and they are living in a greater experiences of Islamophobia. They are feeling very kind of fearful of the headlines that they read, and fundamentally, I think we've got to keep understanding and reminding ourselves that in this particular incident, we are not opening up to a blasphemy law. We have very clear separation of powers. Kemi is trying to sort of politicise the judiciary, I think, which is not helpful. And absolutely that at the same time, we can protect the freedom of speech that we absolutely all uphold, but recognise that there is limits on that, because there are limits. We should not be putting other people at risk through
very briefly.
Nobody's at risk from speech, but you do have to understand that for millions of people in this country, they feel as though their rightful concerns about a range of issues, and by the way, there has been an Islamist intervention into this country which has resulted in terrorism, murder, fear, and anybody who raises some of these problems are demonised. And you've got to acknowledge that the divisive nature of this are people who say, you cannot speak your mind or say anything about this. And I use the example of the grooming gangs because often you'll hear politicians say, we have to ring-fence this idea because it's dangerous, because we don't know what the consequences will be. That is an assault on freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. And so my concern, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable one, is that we don't keep associating these views with extremist, dangerous ideas. And, there are people who will say that there are organisations...
Claire, can I just make that